The journey begins. Sergeant Maya Jackson had been in countless dangerous situations before. There were the firefights, the ambushes, the endless days spent moving from one uncertain location to the next, never knowing if the next step would be her last. But none of those battles could compare to the internal war that had raged in her heart after her deployment ended. The battlefields of Iraq and Afghanistan were filled with the sound of gunfire, the shrill of alarms, and the grim reality of death. But when she stepped off the military transport plane and onto the civilian flight that would take her back home, the weight of the war seemed to catch up with her all at once. Maya's chest felt tight, and her breath was shallow as she moved through the terminal. It wasn't that she wasn't grateful to be returning home. She had missed her family and friends, the familiar smells of home-cooked meals, the quiet moments spent in peace. But the return felt like something more complicated than simply stepping back into her old life. The war had changed her in ways that she wasn't sure how to navigate. The world she left behind felt distant now, as though she were looking at it through a foggy window. The uniform she wore, once a symbol of pride and purpose, now felt heavy, burdened with memories, both good and painful, and an overwhelming sense of weariness. Maya had grown used to the feeling of being at war, even if the weight of it didn't always feel like a badge of honor. Soldiers were expected to carry the hardships, the sacrifices, and the endless expectations. But the truth was that Maya wasn't sure what to expect once she stepped off that plane and onto American soil. How would the world see her? Would they understand the cost of her service? Or would she be just another person in a crowd, lost among the millions of others who went about their daily lives? As she made her way toward her gate, she couldn't help but reflect on what she had just gone through. The emotional and physical toll had been immense. Maya had lost friends, good friends, people she had laughed with, worked alongside, and fought to protect. There had been moments of pure terror, when death had been so close that it felt like an old, familiar friend waiting just beyond the horizon. Yet despite all of this, Maya had survived. She had made it through the chaos, the uncertainty, and the grief. And now, she was heading home. Flight 345 was her last leg of the journey. As the passengers began to board, Maya took a deep breath. It felt surreal, like this moment, stepping onto a civilian aircraft, away from the war zone, was an escape, yet a different kind of challenge awaited her. She had made it through the hell of war, but how would she handle the transition back to civilian life? Would the rest of the world understand? Or would she forever be an outsider in a place that used to feel like home? The flight attendants were smiling as they guided passengers to their seats, their faces friendly, but Maya could see the fleeting glances of curiosity from some of the other passengers. She had learned not to care about what strangers thought, but something about the stares made her feel like an exhibit. Her military uniform almost an invitation for judgment. She had grown accustomed to the looks that soldiers got in public places. Some were filled with respect, others with pity, and many with simple curiosity. But today, as Maya walked down the aisle to her assigned seat, it wasn't the admiration or the discomfort that caught her attention. It was something else. It was the offer of first class. The flight attendant smiled as she handed Maya her boarding pass. "Sergeant Jackson," she said warmly, "you'll be sitting in 1A. Enjoy your flight." Maya blinked in disbelief. First class. She had never traveled in first class before. Hell, she had rarely traveled comfortably at all, let alone been offered a seat in the front of the plane. The cramped economy class seats, the long hours of restless sleep, and the lack of space to stretch her legs. These were the things she was used to. This was a world of privilege she had never experienced. She nodded in stunned acknowledgement, almost unable to process what had just happened. Maya made her way to the front of the plane, her tired legs feeling heavier with each step. She had to admit, though, that there was something luxurious about the first-class section. Plush seats, extra legroom, and the feeling of space. It felt like a temporary escape from the discomforts she had grown used to. When she sank into her seat, Maya allowed herself a rare moment of relaxation. She had earned this moment, hadn't she? She had fought on the front lines for months. She had spent sleepless nights trying to stay awake on guard duty, and she had witnessed the kind of horror that only those who had served in combat could truly understand. For just a moment, she closed her eyes and let herself enjoy the comfort. But even as the soft seat cradled her tired body, her mind remained alert. Maya was a soldier, always on guard, even in the quietest of moments. The plane began to fill with passengers, and Maya could hear the low murmur of voices around her. She tried to push the unease away, but it wasn't easy. The discomfort she felt wasn't from the flight or from the travel itself. It was from the way she perceived others' gazes. People noticed her. They noticed her uniform. They noticed her. And for a brief moment, she questioned whether she really belonged in this seat. She had never had anything handed to her easily, and this moment felt different. This moment felt unearned. But before she could fully process her thoughts, a man walked down the aisle, his presence commanding attention. He was dressed in a sleek dark suit, his shoes polished to perfection, his hair immaculately styled. His face, however, was what stood out the most. He carried himself with an air of arrogance, as if the world owed him something, as though he were entitled to more than what anyone else had. He looked at Maya, and their eyes met. For a brief moment, she felt a strange jolt of tension in the air. She couldn't explain it, but something about the way he looked at her made her bristle. He stopped in front of her seat, staring at the number above her head. A moment later, his gaze shifted downward to meet her eyes. "You're in my seat," he said, his voice calm but dripping with a quiet kind of entitlement. Maya glanced at the seat number on her ticket, and then back at him. "No, I'm in 1A, she said, her voice firm. "This is my seat." The man's smile faltered, but only for a moment. He gave her an appraising look, as if trying to decide what to make of her, this soldier sitting in what he clearly considered to be his domain. Then he spoke again, his tone dripping with disdain, his words laced with a sense of superiority. "First class is for people who've earned it," he said, the words echoing in Maya's mind like an accusation. "Not for charity cases like you." The words struck her like a slap, cold and sharp. Maya felt her fists clench at her sides. The nerve of this man, to assume that just because she wore a uniform, just because she was black, she didn't deserve to sit in the front of the plane. She had earned her place, not just on this flight, but in this world. She had fought for her country. She had sacrificed. What right did he have to speak to her like that? But instead of responding with anger, Maya remained calm. She could feel the heat rising inside her, but she pushed it down. There was no need for a scene. She had learned long ago that confronting ignorance often did nothing but breed more hostility. She didn't need to prove anything to this man. Not now. Not here. "I'm a soldier," Maya said, her voice steady despite the rising tide of fury within her. "I've earned my place." The man gave her a derisive look, and the corner of his mouth curled up into a smirk. "Soldiers belong in the back," he said, his voice filled with contempt. "Not up here with the rest of us." Maya felt her heart race. She could feel the other passengers watching, their eyes flicking back and forth between them. She could feel their judgment. This wasn't just about this man. It was about all of the people who saw her and others like her as less than. Her grip on her ticket tightened, and she tried to breathe through the anger. She had to be strong. She had to stand her ground. But for the first time in a long while, the weight of her uniform felt heavier than ever. The flight attendant appeared, sensing the tension between them. "Is everything all right here?" she asked, her voice polite but alert. The man didn't hesitate. He immediately launched into his complaint, his voice dripping with disdain. "This woman seems to think she belongs in first class," he said. The flight attendant's response was firm. "Sergeant Jackson is exactly where she belongs," she said, standing tall in defense of Maya. "If you have a problem, I'll be happy to assist you in finding another seat." The man's face flushed with embarrassment and anger, and for a moment, Maya thought he might argue further. But he didn't. With a sharp turn, he stormed down the aisle, muttering under his breath. Maya sighed in relief but remained on edge. As the plane began to ascend, she couldn't shake the feeling of discomfort that had settled in her chest. She had won the small battle, but the war, the battle for respect, was still ahead. The confrontation. As the plane climbed higher into the sky, Maya sat back in her plush seat, trying to focus on the calming rhythm of the engines. The gentle hum of the aircraft was almost soothing, a welcome break from the tension that had marked the start of her journey. She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the exhaustion that had built up over the last few days weigh heavily on her shoulders. It had been a long deployment, one that stretched her to her limits both physically and emotionally. Now, all she wanted was to sleep, to drift into the peaceful oblivion of rest, far from the sounds of gunfire, the smell of burning debris, and the constant fear that had defined her time in the field. But despite her fatigue, her mind kept returning to the encounter with the man who had nearly ruined this rare moment of peace. His words echoed in her mind. "First class is for people who've earned it, not for charity cases like you." The audacity of his statement was like a slap in the face, and Maya could feel the sting of it deep in her gut. How dare he? How could someone so blatantly dismiss her as undeserving, as if her years of service meant nothing? Maya had spent years in the military, risking her life time and time again for a country that often seemed indifferent to the struggles of those who served it. She had lost friends in the line of duty, watched comrades die in her arms, and witnessed horrors that no one should ever have to see. And yet, despite it all, she had always stood proud, knowing that her sacrifices were for a cause greater than herself. But now, in the middle of a flight home, she was being treated like an intruder in a space she had earned by virtue of her hard work and dedication. Her grip tightened on the armrests of her seat as she tried to push the anger aside. She knew she shouldn't let this man's words get to her. She had learned long ago that the opinions of strangers didn't define her, but this time it felt different. This wasn't just some passing insult, it was an attack on everything she stood for. She had fought for this country, for the freedom it promised, and now she was being told she didn't deserve a seat at the front of a plane. The injustice of it all was suffocating. The hum of the engines seemed louder now, almost deafening, as Maya's thoughts spiraled. Her mind drifted back to the battlefield, to the days when her survival depended on the unity and camaraderie of her fellow soldiers. Back in the field, there was no room for prejudice, no room for judgment based on the color of someone's skin or the uniform they wore. Everyone was in it together, fighting for a common purpose. But here, in the calm of the sky, it felt as if she was standing alone. She glanced out of the window, watching as the clouds stretched out beneath them, an endless sea of white. The world below seemed so far away, so disconnected from the small world inside the airplane. Yet, she couldn't escape the discomfort that still lingered in the air. It was as if the presence of the man, with his sharp suit and his sense of entitlement, had cast a shadow over the flight, one that no amount of physical distance could erase. Maya's thoughts were interrupted as the flight attendants began to serve drinks and snacks to the passengers. The calm routine of the cabin seemed to have a settling effect on the others, and most of the passengers returned to their books or laptops, quietly minding their own business. But not the man. He was still sitting just a few rows behind her, and Maya could feel his presence like a dark cloud hovering just over her shoulder. Every time the flight attendants passed by, she could see him staring at her out of the corner of her eye, his gaze unwavering, his expression still thick with disdain. Maya did her best to ignore him. She focused on the small TV screen in front of her, trying to lose herself in a movie or a book, anything to distract her from the unsettling feeling that gnawed at her. But no matter how much she tried, her thoughts always circled back to him, the man who had made her question her place in the world. She felt the weight of his eyes on her like an invisible hand, pushing down on her chest, making it harder and harder to breathe. Her frustration grew with each passing minute. The man's arrogance was palpable, and it wasn't just his words that bothered her. It was the way he carried himself, as though the world revolved around him. The entitlement in his demeanor was suffocating, and Maya couldn't help but wonder how many people in the world shared his attitude. How many people judged others based on things they could never control. How many people saw people like her, as less than, as unworthy, simply because of the uniform she wore or the color of her skin. She couldn't escape it. The thought that she would have to continue facing this kind of prejudice, this kind of narrow-minded thinking, long after she left the military, left her feeling exhausted. She had thought that going home would be a return to peace, to normalcy. But now, more than ever, she realized that the fight for equality, for dignity, was far from over. The flight attendants continued to circulate, offering snacks and drinks, but Maya barely touched any of it. Her stomach was in knots, her mind racing. She was too consumed by the anger and frustration that had been building up inside her since the moment the man had spoken to her. His words had struck a nerve, and now she was caught in a storm of emotions: resentment, sadness, and a sense of betrayal. Despite all the comforts of first class, despite the extra legroom and the plush seats, she felt no peace. The contrast between the comfort of her surroundings and the discomfort in her heart was jarring. It was a reminder that no matter how far she had come, no matter how much she had sacrificed, there would always be people like him, people who saw her as something less, who dismissed her as unworthy. Maya closed her eyes, trying to steady her breathing. She needed to calm down. She needed to center herself before the storm inside her boiled over. She had been through so much worse, had survived war zones, combat situations, and life or death scenarios. This man, his words, his prejudice, were nothing compared to the enemy she had faced on the battlefield. And yet, this was different. This wasn't an enemy she could fight with weapons or strategy. This was a battle of the mind, of words, of the way people saw her and judged her based on things she couldn't control. But Maya wasn't someone who backed down from a challenge. She had faced the harshest conditions in the world, and she had survived. She wasn't about to let the narrow views of one man, one person, define who she was. The flight continued its steady course, and Maya made a decision. She would not let this moment, this encounter, define her journey home. She would rise above it, like she had risen above so many other challenges in her life. But first, she needed to make this man understand. If not for herself, then for every person who had ever been treated like they didn't belong, like they weren't good enough. The rest of the flight passed in a blur. Maya's thoughts were a swirl of emotions, but she found solace in the quiet resolve that had settled over her. This moment, this confrontation, wasn't just about the man or his words. It was about standing tall, about being proud of who she was and what she had done. She had earned her place, both on this flight and in this world. And no one, not even someone like him, could take that away from her. As the plane began its descent, Maya gathered her belongings, preparing herself for what would come next. There was a small, determined smile on her lips now. She knew that the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but she was ready for whatever challenges lay in her path. This was just one battle, a battle of words, of perception, but it was one she was determined to win. Reflecting on the battlefield. As the plane continued its steady ascent, Maya's thoughts drifted away from the turbulence of the moment and back to the memories of her past, the memories of a life lived in constant motion, in constant danger. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, letting her mind wander as she tried to find a place of inner peace amidst the storm that brewed within her. But despite the quiet hum of the plane, the rhythmic sound of the engines, and the plush comfort of first class, her thoughts refused to calm. The past year had been an endless whirlwind. It was hard to think of home, of peace, when she had spent so long entrenched in war zones. The heat of the desert, the dust in the air, the ever-present fear that death could come at any moment. It all felt like another life, another world. Maya had spent months in the trenches, facing constant danger, and now, as she sat in the calm comfort of a commercial airplane, she couldn't escape the internal battles that raged in her mind. She hadn't expected it to be easy, this transition from war to peace. Soldiers often said that there was no such thing as a normal life after deployment, that the world outside the military was different, strange even. Maya had heard those stories, but hearing them and experiencing them were two entirely different things. The simplicity of civilian life now seemed alien to her. It was more than just a matter of adjusting back to a schedule or learning how to relax. It was about finding herself again. Maya had been so immersed in the mission, in the daily survival of the battlefield, that she had lost pieces of herself along the way. She had lost the feeling of being just Maya, just a woman, instead of Sergeant Jackson, the soldier, the warrior. The man's words, the ones that had stung her so deeply earlier, had opened a wound that had been festering for some time. First class is for people who've earned it, not for charity cases like you. That sentence echoed in her head, repeated like a drumbeat that would not quiet. Maya had fought, bled, and cried for this country. She had stood in the face of danger, defied death, and seen the aftermath of violence. She had watched comrades fall, had been the one to carry their bodies home. And yet somehow, this man, this complete stranger, felt entitled to belittle her. His words suggested that her place in this world, her value as a person, was somehow less because of her uniform, less because of the color of her skin, less because of the perceived otherness that he saw when he looked at her. But what made it worse, what made it unbearable, was the truth Maya had been trying to deny. This wasn't just about him. This was about everyone who had ever looked at her and seen only the uniform, or only her race, or only the other parts of her identity. This was about a lifetime of experiences, of moments when she had been treated as less than because of things beyond her control. As a black woman in a predominantly white military, Maya had often faced discrimination, subtle and not so subtle forms of racism. But this was different. This was personal. It wasn't just the man's blatant prejudice. It was the reminder that her entire existence, her entire being, was still subject to the prejudices of others, no matter how hard she fought to prove her worth. Her hands, still gripping the armrests of the seat, trembled slightly as the realization sank in. What had she sacrificed all this time for? Was it for the uniform? Was it for the admiration of strangers? Or was it for something deeper, something more profound than anyone would ever understand? Maya's thoughts were interrupted when a flight attendant passed by, offering drinks. She shook her head, not really feeling thirsty, not really feeling anything at all, other than the gnawing emptiness that seemed to grow with every passing minute. She watched as the attendant moved on, taking care of the other passengers, all of whom seemed unaware of the emotional war that was raging inside her. She caught a glimpse of the man again, his eyes flicking toward her from across the aisle. He was sitting back in his seat, a drink in hand, looking out the window. His expression had softened somewhat, but Maya could still sense his discomfort, his unease. Maybe he hadn't expected her to fight back. Maybe he hadn't anticipated that she would stand her ground, unflinching in the face of his arrogance. What was he thinking now? Had he realized how wrong he was, how unjust his assumptions had been? Or was he simply angry that someone had dared to challenge him, to put him in his place? Maya didn't know, and honestly, she didn't care. She had been through enough to know that her worth wasn't determined by anyone else's opinion. Her thoughts continued to spiral back to the battlefield, to the endless days spent in constant vigilance, to the nights when sleep was a luxury she couldn't afford. In the military, survival was the ultimate goal. It didn't matter who you were, where you came from, or what you looked like. You were all in it together, bound by a single mission: survival. But out here, in the world beyond war, it seemed like survival was a constant battle for respect, for dignity, for basic human decency. Maya felt the sharp sting of frustration surge within her once again. She had spent so many years fighting on the front lines, facing an enemy she could identify. But now, in this moment of relative peace, she was fighting an invisible enemy, an enemy that wore the guise of prejudice, ignorance, and judgment. And what made it worse was that this enemy wasn't foreign. It wasn't the faceless opponent she had faced in the desert. It was here, in her own country, in the hearts and minds of those who had never fought, never sacrificed, never been exposed to the harsh realities of the world she had seen. It was people like the man on the plane, people who had never had to fight for their place, for their humanity, for their dignity. Maya shook her head, trying to push the negative thoughts aside. There was no use in dwelling on the anger, no use in letting it consume her. She had learned that lesson in the field. Anger, if left unchecked, could burn you from the inside out, hollowing you out until there was nothing left. She couldn't let that happen. Not now, not here. Instead, Maya decided to focus on something else, something that was within her control. She reached into the pocket of the seat in front of her and pulled out the in-flight stationery. The paper felt cool against her fingertips as she smoothed it out on the tray table. She grabbed a pen and began to write. She wasn't sure who she was writing to, but in that moment, it didn't matter. The words flowed from her like a release, a way to let the tension out, to give voice to the anger and confusion that churned inside her. She wrote about sacrifice, about service, about the long days and nights spent in the heat of battle, about the camaraderie and the loss. She wrote about the things that people didn't see, the things that weren't talked about in polite conversation. She wrote about what it meant to be a soldier, what it meant to fight for something bigger than yourself, and how that sacrifice was often invisible to those who had never experienced it. As she wrote, the tightness in her chest began to loosen, the anger and frustration giving way to a sense of clarity. Writing had always been a way for Maya to process her feelings, a way to make sense of the chaos in her life. And now, it was giving her a way to reclaim her peace. By the time she finished, Maya's hand ached from the effort, but there was a sense of catharsis in the final stroke of the pen. She folded the letter carefully, her thoughts still swirling but her mind a little clearer. She wasn't sure what she was going to do with the letter. She didn't know if she would ever send it, or even share it with anyone. But in that moment, it felt like a small victory, a way to assert her own voice, her own power, in a world that often tried to silence it. Maya leaned back in her seat, letting out a deep breath. The journey ahead would be long, filled with unknown challenges. But she was ready. She had faced down enemies in foreign lands. Now she was facing an enemy that was even more insidious, an enemy that lived in the hearts and minds of people who couldn't see beyond their own narrow views. But Maya was stronger than that. She would not be defeated. Not now. Not ever. The plane began its descent, the clouds below a vast expanse of white. Maya's thoughts drifted back to her family, to the home she was about to return to. She had been away for too long, and the time had come to reclaim her place in the world, not as a soldier, but as Maya Jackson, a woman who had survived, who had fought, and who had earned her place in this world. The delivery. As the descent began, the soft whir of the airplane's engines seemed to slow, and the familiar hum of altitude loss filled the cabin with a gentle shift. The plane tilted slightly. The slow decline into the welcoming arms of home began, and Maya's mind was still clouded with turmoil. The man was seated a few rows behind her now, but the weight of the confrontation still lingered. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the folded letter in her lap. The words she had written in haste were now heavy with meaning, and the idea of actually giving them to him, confronting him, felt like an insurmountable task. Maya had been through much worse. She had been on battlefields where the stakes were much higher than the petty quarrels that seemed to define the civilian world. Yet somehow, this encounter, this personal, drawn-out humiliation, felt more profound than anything she had faced in the field. The mental toll of it was heavier than the physical pain of her wounds, which had long since healed. No matter how much she tried to push it aside, the fact remained. His words had cut deep, and the aftershocks of that moment rattled her even now. As the plane continued its descent, her resolve began to build slowly but surely. She knew that the real battle wasn't one fought with guns or knives. It was fought with words, with understanding, and with the capacity to look beyond one's own biases to see the humanity in another person. She had experienced it before in combat, when soldiers from different backgrounds had been forced to work together, to fight together for the greater good. If they could do it, so could she. She wasn't going to let this man's ignorance dictate her peace, her journey, or her sense of self-worth. Maya looked out the window, watching as the ground drew closer, the patchwork of the world below beginning to take shape. She thought of her family waiting at the gate, the smiles they would greet her with. They were waiting for her, for their daughter, their sister, their friend, not for Sergeant Jackson, the soldier, but for Maya, the person they loved. She could almost feel the warmth of her mother's embrace, the pride in her father's eyes. That was the love that mattered, not the judgment of strangers who didn't know the real her. The thought of seeing them, of stepping back into a world where she didn't have to explain herself, where she was simply loved for who she was, brought a quiet smile to her lips. But as she prepared to leave the plane, the nagging voice of self-doubt still whispered at the back of her mind. What if she just let it go? What if she pretended the encounter had never happened? The man had already been reprimanded by the flight attendant, and there was a part of Maya that considered the ease of walking away from the whole situation, allowing it to fade into the past where it belonged. But there was a deeper part of her that refused to let go, the part of her that had survived the worst of times and come out stronger. It wasn't just about defending herself. It was about making a statement, about standing up for what was right. What this man had done was wrong, and she couldn't let that kind of behavior go unchecked, especially not when it affected not just her, but so many others who suffered silently in similar ways. Her heartbeat quickened as she stood up, her legs stiff and sore from hours of travel, but her mind was clear. She grabbed her bag from the overhead compartment, pausing to glance down at the letter one more time. There was no turning back now. She knew what she had to do. Maya moved slowly down the aisle, carefully making her way toward the man who had caused her so much frustration. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her with each step, but she didn't falter. There was no hesitation now. She had fought for her place in this world, had earned every inch of the ground beneath her feet. This moment, this encounter, wasn't going to break her. If anything, it was going to strengthen her. The man looked up as she approached, his eyes briefly widening in surprise. For a moment, Maya could see the cockiness drain from his face, replaced by something unfamiliar. Was it guilt? Fear? Or perhaps it was just surprise that someone had dared to challenge him, to hold him accountable for his actions. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat as she drew nearer, his body language tense, but Maya refused to back down. She didn't flinch. She didn't turn away. She simply walked up to him and stood in front of his seat, looking him squarely in the eye. "This is for you," she said, her voice steady but firm. She held out the folded note with both hands, her eyes locked on his. The words that she had written, filled with emotion and the weight of her experiences, now hung between them. The air was thick with tension, but Maya wasn't afraid. She had spent far too long fighting invisible battles for her to shy away from this one. The man hesitated, as if unsure of what to do, as if he couldn't comprehend why she would be offering him anything. For a moment, he just stared at her, his expression blank, unreadable. He didn't take the letter immediately, and Maya could see the flicker of confusion in his eyes, as though he didn't understand what he had done wrong, as though he was unsure how to handle this confrontation. Maya stood there, unwavering, her hand outstretched with the letter, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the tension radiating off of him, but she didn't budge. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the man reached up slowly, his hand trembling just slightly, and took the letter from her. There was no apology in his eyes, no acknowledgement of the harm he had caused, but there was something else, something that Maya couldn't quite place, a flicker of shame, a glimmer of recognition. She didn't know, and in that moment, it didn't matter. She had done what she needed to do. She had stood up for herself, for every person who had ever been disrespected, dehumanized, or judged unfairly. Maya gave him one final look, her expression neutral but resolute. Then, without a word, she turned and walked back to her seat. Her steps were steady, her breathing even. She could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her, their curiosity palpable, but she didn't care. What mattered now was that she had made her stand. It wasn't about winning or losing, not really. It was about making her voice heard, about showing this man, and everyone else, that disrespect wouldn't be tolerated. As Maya settled back into her seat, she couldn't help but feel a strange sense of release. The tension that had gripped her all through the flight slowly began to melt away, replaced by a quiet peace. The journey ahead would not be easy, she knew that. There were many battles still to be fought, many people still to educate, many prejudices still to challenge. But for now, she had done what she could. She had confronted the injustice, and in doing so, she had reminded herself of her strength, her worth, and her unbreakable resolve. The plane touched down, and Maya stood once more, gathering her belongings and preparing to disembark. She noticed the man's face as he unfolded the letter, his eyes scanning the words. He didn't look up at her, but there was something about the way he held the letter, carefully, almost reverently, that made Maya pause. Perhaps the message had reached him after all. Maybe he would think differently about her, about soldiers, about people who had been judged simply because they didn't fit someone else's idea of worthy. But she didn't wait to see. She didn't need to. The doors to the plane opened, and Maya stepped out, her steps confident and sure. There were people waiting for her on the other side, people who loved her, who had always seen her for who she truly was. That was where she was going now, to a place where she could finally rest, where she could finally let go of the weight of judgment, and simply be. And in that moment, Maya knew that this was just one small chapter in a larger story, one that she was still writing, one that no one could take away from her. A shocking apology. The days following Maya's flight felt like a blur. She had returned home, finally, to the place where she could shed the weight of her uniform and be Maya again. The daughter, the sister, the friend. The soft embrace of her mother, the hearty laugh of her father, the warm familiarity of the streets she had once roamed with a sense of freedom. These things, these people, were her true refuge. She had come home to this peace, but there was no escaping the lingering echo of the incident on the plane. Maya hadn't expected the confrontation to impact her this way. The moment she had handed that letter to the man had felt like a small victory, an act of reclaiming her dignity in the face of someone who saw her as less than. But as the days passed, the weight of the exchange became more apparent, both emotionally and mentally. The anger, the frustration, the sting of his words still gnawed at her. And yet there was a sense of resolution, too, a quiet kind of pride in knowing that she had stood up for herself, for others like her, and for everyone who had ever been underestimated or judged based on superficial qualities. Still, part of Maya wondered what had happened after that. Had the man read her words? Had he taken them to heart? Or had he dismissed her letter, her plea for understanding, with the same arrogance and entitlement that had defined his initial interaction with her? Maya had made peace with the idea that she might never know the answer. She had done what she needed to do, and whether or not he changed, whether or not he understood, was not within her control. One afternoon, as she sat at the kitchen table, sipping a cup of tea and laughing at a joke her younger brother had made, there was a knock on the door. It was an unexpected sound, one that broke the peaceful rhythm of the household. Maya rose to answer it, wiping the laughter from her face, wondering who could be at the door. She opened it, and there, standing before her, was a man she recognized. The same man from the plane. He looked different now. His sharp suit was gone, replaced with more casual attire, but his posture was stiff, hesitant. There was a strange look in his eyes, something she hadn't expected. Was it embarrassment? Regret? He stood there, nervously shifting on his feet, unsure of what to say next. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Maya felt the weight of the silence hang between them, thick with unspoken words and unresolved tension. Sergeant Jackson, the man finally said, his voice quieter than she had remembered it. I know this might seem strange, but I needed to see you." Maya blinked, caught off guard by his presence. She hadn't expected him to seek her out, let alone come all the way to her home. She didn't know what to say, so she simply nodded and stepped aside to let him enter. I owed you an apology," he continued, his eyes downcast. "I know I hurt you on that plane. I was wrong, and I need to own up to it. I've been thinking about what you wrote, and, well, it's changed the way I see things. You made me realize how narrow my perspective has been. I've spent my whole life thinking I understood the world, thinking I had everything figured out, but I was wrong." Maya studied him, surprised by his sincerity. His words, though shaky, seemed genuine. The man who had once looked at her with disdain was now standing in front of her, admitting his mistake, acknowledging the harm he had caused. It was a rare sight. An apology, not laced with excuses or deflection, but one that came with humility and the recognition of his own shortcomings. "I've been a selfish man, to be honest," he continued, his voice thick with regret. "I've always been used to getting what I want, and when I saw you in that seat, I reacted without thinking. I never considered your side, your sacrifice, what you've been through. All I saw was a woman in a uniform, and I let my ignorance take over. But that's not an excuse." Maya took a slow breath, processing the words he was saying. She had expected him to be defensive, to make light of the situation, or perhaps try to justify his actions. But instead, here he was, speaking with the kind of vulnerability that most people would never show. It was disarming, to say the least. It was also a reminder of something Maya had learned long ago: the power of a true apology, one that came from a place of self-awareness and change. "You don't owe me anything," Maya said quietly, still processing the surreal nature of the moment. "You don't have to apologize to me. It's not about me. It's about what your words meant, about how they affect people like me, people who have given everything for a country that often doesn't see them for who they really are." The man nodded, his expression somber. "I get that now, and I'm sorry. I'm truly sorry." There was a long pause, the weight of the conversation settling between them. Maya felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected him to come to her door, to express such genuine remorse. She had thought their encounter on the plane would be something she would carry with her forever, a reminder of the ignorance she would always face. But now, it felt like something different. It felt like a moment of growth, not just for him, but for her too. "Thank you for coming," Maya said softly. "It's not easy to admit when you're wrong, but what matters is that you've taken the time to reflect, to understand. That's more than I could have asked for." The man gave her a small, appreciative smile, and for the first time, there was no arrogance in his eyes. There was only a quiet humility, a man who had been forced to confront his own prejudices and had come out on the other side better for it. It was a rare thing, Maya thought, to witness someone change in real time, to see the walls they had built up over the years crumble before their own eyes. And in this moment, it wasn't just about the apology. It was about the possibility for transformation, for the power of understanding to heal even the deepest of wounds. Before he left, the man handed Maya a small card. It was simple, understated, but the words written on it made her pause. "I've started volunteering at a local veterans organization," he said, his voice hesitant but earnest. "I'm trying to give back in some small way, to make up for my ignorance. It's not much, but it's a start. I just wanted to thank you, not just for your service, but for the lesson you taught me. You've changed the way I see the world. And for that, I am truly grateful." Maya took the card, a mixture of emotions swirling inside her. She didn't know what to say, so she simply nodded. "Good luck," she said, her voice steady. "I hope you continue to learn, and I hope you keep growing." With that, the man turned and left, the door closing behind him with a soft click. Maya stood in the quiet of the hallway, the card still in her hand, her thoughts racing. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected anything at all. Really. But in the end, the encounter on the plane had become something more than a confrontation. It had become a lesson, not just for the man, but for herself. In a world filled with prejudice and division, there was always room for growth, for change, for understanding. Maya had known this before, but now she felt it in her bones. This wasn't the end of her journey, nor was it the end of the man's. It was a new beginning, for both of them. As she placed the card on the table, a small smile tugged at the corner of her lips. She hadn't expected much from the man when she handed him that letter, but what had come from it was something far greater than she could have imagined. A genuine connection, a step toward healing, and the realization that even in the most unlikely of moments, there was potential for transformation. The journey ahead wasn't going to be easy, but Maya was ready for it. After all, this was just one chapter in a much larger story, and she knew that, just like the man, she would continue to grow, continue to fight, and continue to find ways to bridge the gaps that separated people, one encounter at a time.